Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to chat about some books that I've read recently. Some of these I read in September, and then a lot of them I've read in October. We're getting ready to start Nonfiction November here in just a few short days, which I'm very excited about. But before we do that, I thought I would talk to you a little bit about some of the great and then one not so great book that I've picked up recently. This is the time of year that I love to pick up more feel-good works of fiction. I like to pick up books that feel cozy. I like to put on my cozy clothing, as you can see, and really sink in to some feel-good fiction. I've picked up 3 books like that recently. One of them I really liked. One of them I would go so far as to say I loved. And then the third one, not so much. I could only get about 15% of the way into it before I felt forced to DNF it. So we'll talk about all 3. The one I really liked was called We'll Prescribe You a Cat by Sayu Ishida, which I would say falls into this new-ish subgenre that I've been noticing. There are these very cozy, slightly magical books translated from Japanese. It's this very niche subgenre that seems to be skyrocketing in popularity. I've not read a ton of books like that, but I was definitely pulled in by this one because the premise is that if you go to this one clinic, they will prescribe you a cat to help you deal with your problems. You have to be referred to even be able to find the place. If someone hasn't told you about it, then you will walk past this place and not even know that there's a clinic there. So someone has to tell you about it. And then once you go in, you will be greeted very rudely by the receptionist. She is not a very nice person. But then once you do finally get in to talk to the doctor, he seems like he's on a different planet as you're explaining your symptoms, but then at the end of all of it, he will write you a prescription for one specific cat. And through serendipitous means, that cat will go on to solve whatever mental roadblock you're currently dealing with. It's technically a novel in stories because we have all of these different stories of people coming in and receiving their cat and then working through their problems, but the stories don't have much more to do with one another besides that clinic. So I would say the clinic sits at the center of everything, and then we learn about the individual stories of people being given their feline assistance and then working through their problems. It's just as silly and whimsical as it sounds. It's very unserious. It's nothing life-changing, but it is really easy reading. It's a lot of fun, and I would recommend it if you love cats. As I do, my life essentially revolves around my 2 cats, so I really like this. The cozy book that I loved, though, was called The Ornithologist's Field Guide to Love by India Holton. This is a book that several of you went out of your way to let me know about. You wanted to make sure I knew about this one because you thought I would really like it. And thank you very much for that. I really appreciate you. You were absolutely right. This was incredible. It is a so-called fantasy of manners. It's set in an alternate version of England in which magical birds exist, and therefore ornithologists, or people who study birds, are a lot more Indiana Jones-like than they are in our universe. And in this alternate universe, the Ornithological Society announces that an exceedingly rare magical bird has been spotted in England, and they give a challenge to all of the ornithologists, saying whoever can capture that magical bird will be named Birder of the Year and will receive tenure at their respective university. That announcement kicks off an all-out war between ornithologists, who are all trying to one-up each other, outsmart each other in their quest to win, including our social misfit but absolutely brilliant main character, Beth, who is the country's youngest professor. And then there's her rival, the dashing and famous Devon. And they are trying to beat one another at this competition. They're sort of working together, but they also want to win. And they're trying to ignore their feelings for one another as they're doing all of this. And we as readers get a hefty dose of dramatic irony through the entire thing, because we get to see that this entire thing is an elaborate and evolving publicity stunt. This story just got crazier and crazier with every turn, but also more lovable somehow. Like, it is so bizarre, but it is also so sweet and so funny. I just adored this. I felt at certain points like it was just made for me, like the romance and the birds of it all. Like, I just felt like it suited me so perfectly. And also because it's one of those books that I feel like is so unapologetically itself. Like, it knows what it wants to be, and just goes for it and makes no apologies for it. And I really, really appreciated that about it. I am so glad that I didn't allow my previous experience with a different book by this author. I'm so glad I didn't let that talk me out of giving this a try, because I really would have been missing out. Thank you all so much for recommending this one to me. I think this is going to be one of my favorites of the year. Then there's the third cozy book that I attempted to read. I picked it up just a few days ago and swiftly put it down, like within the same day. I knew it was not going to work for me. It's called The Cottage Around the Corner by D.L. Surya. I guess it serves me right for being pulled in by this gorgeous cover. I knew that was a risk, but this one is set in a small town. Our main character is a witch. She works at her family's struggling magic shop in this town. And then competition pops up when a family of mages, who are the rivals of witches within this universe, they decide to also open up a shop in town. Initially, I did like this premise, although after having read a little bit of this book and thinking about it further, it's a pretty questionable business decision to open up a competing shop in town when the first shop isn't succeeding financially. But I'll leave my robot brain out of this. I thought at the very least that this book had the potential to make me smile, and that's really my only criteria for going into a work of feel-good fiction. I just want to feel nice. I just want it to be a pleasant experience. The main character made it so that I could not have a good experience with this book. I could not stand her. She's supposed to be in her 30s in this book, her early 30s, but her 30s nonetheless, and somehow she completely lacks any sort of emotional regulation. She is deeply insecure, which just by itself is not the reason why I didn't like her. I feel like a lot of people are insecure. We all have our own insecurities. But it's the way that she would treat other people. She'd be kind to their face. Like, obviously she wants people to like her, but she's our main character. We get her inner monologue. So we would see that while she's being nice to people's faces, she's also judging them extremely harshly in her head. And it reminded me a lot of something that my favorite Twitch streamer, Half Moon Joe, likes to say. In a sing-songy way, he always says, "People-pleasing is lying." Because it far too often is. Admittedly, I have a really hard time dealing with what I perceive as phoniness. I don't know if this character just took that customer service perspective from the shop and applied it to her entire life. I don't think you need to be rude to people, but I think it's very disingenuous to pretend that you like someone, to pretend that you're someone that you're not. I just don't deal very well with that. So I already wasn't in love with this character, but not so much that I would straight up put the book down. What definitely helped that along was this series of scenes about this main character's appearance. There is one scene where she's going to pay a visit to the rival store that's getting ready to open up. It was a visit she was not prepared for. It's very out of the blue, but she left the house wearing a ratty t-shirt that she sleeps in, and I guess she didn't have 2 seconds to run a brush through her hair. So she really makes a point of emphasizing that she looks disheveled. She doesn't like it, she's embarrassed by it, she doesn't want people to see her that way, but it just kind of worked out that way. So she's really, really emphasizing that. Then just pages later, she's getting ready to go to a party, and she is taking time to look nice. She's making an effort on her appearance. And then someone compliments her like, "Oh, you look really nice." And her response is something along the lines of, "What, like I don't look nice normally?" According to you, no. Like, don't get me wrong. When I'm not filming or I don't have like a fancy event that I'm going to, I like going what I like to call gremlin mode. Like, if I'm out running errands or just getting groceries or something like that, I'm tidy. Like, I make an effort to look clean and hygienic, but I am certainly not all dolled up. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to take it as an insult when I do make an effort to look nice, that someone like a friend or my husband, if they tell me I look nice, I'm not going to be upset with them. Like, that just makes no sense to me. You're looking for a problem with people. I don't always need to love a book's characters to go on to enjoy it overall. I know that's a condition that some people have, not so much with me. I think when I'm reading literary fiction, actually, I prefer when I dislike the characters, because normally they're messed up in a very complex, intriguing way. I like to dissect what makes a person the way that they are. That's really fun for me. But in a work of feel-good fiction, I would prefer if it just felt good. I want to be able to root for these characters. I want to be able to cheer them on. I want to want good things for them. And that was really, really hard to do when a woman who's supposed to be my peer is acting like a 16-year-old. So, putting this one down felt like an act of self-care. Moving on, though, I did select 2 books to come with me on a trip to Minneapolis that I took, and one of those was The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. This is a work of literary fiction set in what is a real-life bookstore in Minneapolis, owned by this author. The author herself has a very minor role in this book. We just see her be the owner of this bookstore where our real main character works. Our main character is named Tukey, and we see how she gets a job at this bookstore following a prison sentence that she served for a very wild crime that you learn about at the beginning of the book. But throughout most of this book, we see her being haunted by the ghost of an overzealous customer at the bookshop. I had heard really great things about this one prior to picking it up. Many of those things I would now go on to agree with now that I've actually picked this up myself. But I think now that I've read this, I can say that I feel very similarly about it as I did when I read The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, because this is a very, very character-focused book. So I can appreciate this book for all the things that it did, but because I'm the kind of reader who prefers their stories to be at least more plot-dominated than this one was, I don't think I could appreciate it in the way that other readers would. Like, the characters in this book are very lovable, and I like robust characters, but without that central plot, I felt like it just meandered. Not in an unpleasant way, just one that I don't think I was particularly set up to appreciate. I think what I liked most about this book, actually, was how I experienced the earliest chapters of it. I had heard from a couple of people before I even picked this one up that the audiobook version of this one was narrated by the author, and people said it was really fantastic. So that is how I chose to consume this book, and I was listening to those earliest chapters when I was at the Pittsburgh airport waiting for my flight to Minneapolis. I got through security way faster than I thought I was going to, and I was doing a step challenge at the time, and I thought it would be great if I could get the majority of my steps in before I even went to Minneapolis. I didn't know how much walking I was going to be doing later on that day. So as I waited for my flight to board, I did what I now know is called rucking. I threw my backpack on, which was the entirety of my luggage, so it was on the heavier side, and I just briskly walked around the terminals for an hour or so. I walked 3 miles. I was sweating. I remember that. I was just in the zone as I was listening to this book, just doing those laps around the terminals. It was actually a really good time. Those early sections were so good, but I remember as I boarded my flight, I was kind of wondering, where is this going? Because I felt like we had burned through so much interesting story in those early chapters. The story about Tukey's crime, the story of her serving time in prison, the story of the death of this customer and how she began to be haunted. Like, I felt like that was an entire book's worth of material just in those early sections. And I didn't feel particularly motivated to go read the rest. Like, I felt like I had consumed so much in those early chapters, and I was so unsure about how it was going to conclude that it actually took me a really long time to circle back around to this one and finish it up. And I ended up being rather disappointed by like the back 75% of this book. I felt like the first 25% was so strong, and I really enjoyed my experience of listening to those chapters. I don't know if the other chapters could have ever lived up to my impression of those early ones and the really good experience I had of listening to them in the airport, but at least I enjoyed that part of it. But the other one I brought on my trip was called Rare Gems by Howard Megdal, which is a work of sports nonfiction about the history of women's basketball within the state of Minnesota and all of the big names that helped make it so great, including a lot of former and current WNBA players and some coaches. Howard Megdal is a seasoned sports reporter. I know him from the Locked On Women's Basketball podcast, which I really, really enjoy, although I do wish they would let me edit it because there's so much dead air and it just gives me a twitch. But I also know that Howard Megdal does a lot of writing, which is why it surprised me just how choppy I found this book. Like, we'd be in the midst of one discussion, and then he would just bounce to another discussion, and we'd be kind of in the middle of it. And it made me feel like I had blacked out and missed something. It was very rewarding, though, learning about some of this backstory, some of this lore about women's basketball in the WNBA. I'm a big fan of the WNBA, but I didn't start watching until 2021. So that means that there's a good number of years that I wasn't a fan that I've been trying to catch up on. I've been trying to inform myself about the years before I became a viewer. So this was very beneficial for me to learn more about the importance of women's basketball in Minnesota and how impressive the Lynx have been over the league's history. And it was especially cool to be reading this at the same time that I went to go see a Minnesota Lynx game when I was in Minneapolis, which was so much fun. They had a really formidable squad this year. They went on to be in the finals, contending for a championship, and I think they should have won Game 5, but I will not go into that right now. But another audiobook that I just recently finished was actress Kelly Bishop's memoir, The Third Gilmore Girl. If you're a fellow Gilmore Girls fan, then Kelly Bishop needs no introduction from me, but just in case you don't know who she is, she played Emily Gilmore during the entire run of the series Gilmore Girls. She is the mother of Lauren Graham's character, Lorelai Gilmore. But before all of that, she was a dancer. She originated a role in A Chorus Line. She won a Tony Award for that role. She played Baby's mother in Dirty Dancing, in addition to numerous other acting gigs throughout her career. This book is about her life and career, about the joys that she's had in her life, but also the pain, the things that she's proud of, the things that she's less proud of. Like, she is unflinchingly honest in this memoir. She is feisty. She's wise. She's talented. She is someone I admire so much. And hearing her tell her own story with her own voice made this 10 times better. I know this is one I'm going to want to listen to again at some point in my life. But since we're on the topic of creativity and the arts here, I will bring up this next book. It is a very, very popular work of nonfiction right now. It's called The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. This book tells the wild true story of a French man who became so obsessed with the beauty of specific works of art that he conspired with his lover at the time to steal them and squirrel them away in his residence. And it was all going pretty smoothly for him. Until it wasn't. This author tells this story in an extremely captivating way. Like, I can see why a lot of people have loved this one. It reads like a novel. And I think we get all of that extra juicy detail because this author had so much access to this thief, to the subject of this story. He talked with him. He traveled with him. Like, he had so much access to this guy. So in that way, it reminded me a lot of The Feather Thief, which is a good comparison because I really enjoyed that one as well, and I know many others did also. Where I kept stubbing my toe on this book, though, was this author's insistence that this man, the thief, was not a kleptomaniac. He was not addicted to stealing, and this is a different kind of crime because it's not financially motivated. He didn't want to sell any of these works of art. He just wanted to possess them. And to support that argument, this author has a whole section in this book about how it's possible to almost become drunk on beauty. And that was a really interesting section, but I think that argument completely falls apart at the end of this book when you find out that after all of the events that have transpired, after this man has been caught, after he's suffered the consequences, after he's realized that rock bottom has a basement, he knows that if he continues to steal, he will go directly to jail Monopoly style, and yet he still feels that pull, that urge to steal. He misses the thrill of it. And so he continues to do it, even knowing what the consequences will be. Mr. Finkel, my guy, bring it in. You've just described addiction. Your man is addicted to stealing. It's just that his object of choice is beautiful things. He doesn't have some novel diagnosis because what he likes to steal lives in museums. Let's not get pretentious here. Since I mentioned addiction, though, let me quickly bring up one of the 24 nonfiction books I wanted to make a point of reading in 2024, Dopesick by Beth Macy. This was written by a reporter out of Virginia whose work has largely focused on the opioid crisis in the state of Virginia that has erupted there and really taken over. In this book, she discusses the genesis of it, how it got started, but it does seem like her primary intention with this book is to give the crisis a human face. I had already read about Purdue Pharma pushing OxyContin, getting people hooked on it. I had read all about that in Empire of Pain. But it really, really does hit different when you're reading about real families, real people who were affected by this, people who got hooked through no fault of their own and then struggled to get clean or died prematurely or sometimes both. Like, you will meet real people who've been dealing with this, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. Like, they would be prescribed a pain medication for completely legitimate reasons. Like, they had a sports injury or they had a surgery, and they weren't advised just how easy it was to get addicted to these drugs until it was absolutely too late. And then when these people couldn't get their hands on the pills anymore because their doctor wouldn't write them a script because they figured out that they were hooked on them, or the pills became too expensive, people went to the closest available alternative to keep from getting dope sick. They turned to heroin. This is simultaneously a heartbreaking but also humanizing look at this crisis. You'll learn about how the best methods to keep people clean are ever evolving, especially as there are so many public policy and honestly public opinion hurdles to scale. So if you're looking to really understand this crisis, if you're looking to see the impact that it's had on communities, and if you want to understand more about the nature of addiction, I think this is well worth a read. Back to the topic of the arts, though, another book off of that priority nonfiction books list that I read over this period of time was Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. And this is a book all about creativity. And the author, Elizabeth Gilbert, who also writes novels, she talks about how she perceives creativity, how she welcomes it in, and how she believes that all of us have that spark of creativity within us. We just need to allow it to move us and to motivate us. And so much in this book is so straightforward. It's stuff that you feel like you shouldn't need to be told until she's telling it to you. And you realize how much you needed to hear it, how much it feels like permission that isn't really permission to be creative. I spent so much of my life under the impression that I was not a creative person because I'm this Vulcan-like creature who's much better with numbers versus all the artsy stuff. Like, I've always enjoyed art. I've always liked art and creativity, but I just never felt like it was my strong suit. Until I remember having this realization a few years back that what I do here on YouTube is its own kind of creative endeavor. And ever since that switch flipped for me, it gave me permission to see myself as someone who has the potential to be creative, who may have that little spark within me. But it is really nice having books like this to remind me of that, to reinforce that notion, because sometimes I do so naturally fall back into the logical side of myself. It's nice being reminded that I, like everybody else out there, have that side to myself. So this was really nice. It does get a little woo-woo at times, spiritual in a way that I don't know I'm entirely on board with, but I did see where she was coming from, and I found the vast majority of this really wonderful. Then I read another one from that nonfiction books list. I am very serious about getting all 24 of those books read this year. I swear it. I'm going to get it done. But I read one called The Devil's Element by Dan Egan, which is all about the element phosphorus. It was known as the devil's element because of how volatile an element it is. It is used in things like nerve gas and fire bombs, but its primary use in our modern day is for fertilizer. In this book, the author talks about pretty much everything as it relates to phosphorus, how it was discovered, why it's so essential for plant growth, where fertilizer using phosphorus has been sourced historically, so everything from guano to remote islands. And then the part that I think interests most of us now, the consequences of dumping tons of it onto our crops, the water runoff, and then the resulting toxic algal blooms that seasonally turn different American bodies of water into poisonous dead zones. Like taking a dip in one of those could cost you your life. Not an exaggeration. So even though this is a book about an element on the periodic table, I found that this is much more environmentally focused than straight up science focused, because so much of this book is focused on our use of the fertilizers and how it's thrown off that natural cycle of nature, how we have thrown things out of balance, hence this book's subtitle, and what we could possibly do to fix that. I thought the writing in this book was terrific, like very concise, very tight. I thought he covered so much ground for how short of a book this was. So I thought this was fantastic. I know a lot of this is going to stay with me. Perhaps I feel very confident that that book will stay with me because shortly after I read The Devil's Element, I read another book on algae called Slime by Ruth Kassinger, which discusses all of the current and possible future commercial uses for algae. And I paired that book up with another book called Slime, except that one was by Suzanne Vedlich, and it focused a lot more on slime proper, all of the muck that exists in the natural world, both inside of our bodies and around us, that although it grosses us out, serves a surprising number of critical functions on Earth. In the spirit of Halloween, I recently reviewed both of these books in a separate video I made that I will link for you below and up in the cards if you'd like to learn more about one or both of them. So those were some of the noteworthy books that I've picked up recently. Let me know if you have thoughts on any of these, if you have any recommendations for me, or if you have any more general comments or questions. Any or all of that can go in the comment section below. All the books I spoke about today are listed and linked for you in the description box below for your clicking convenience. And at the very bottom of that exact same description box, you will also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internet. So my Goodreads, Storygraph, Instagram, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I'm reading and doing right now. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.